Okay, so most of what I want to say now is what we might call less linguistic prosodic features. I don't think that they are therefore less important. Many of these are things which are difficult to learn about, but are interesting to observe and do play a role in communication. Rhythm is one thing which crops up in a lot of English teaching material. Everybody knows it's something you can teach. What we don't know is how valuable it is, how important it is that people learning English should learn English rhythm. Tempo, I said, is a neglected field, one which most people feel they can just leave aside. It doesn't have much to do with learning pronunciation or teaching it. Pitch range is often neglected. Many simple textbooks, for example, the section on intonation in my little book, don't go into high falls and low falls and high rises and low rises very much, because it makes it more complicated if you have a larger number of nuclear tones. But this is a controversial area and one in which there is no easy answer. Voice quality I mentioned, something which a few specialised researchers, and particularly John Laver in the UK, have worked on intensively. And pause, again I've mentioned, but I'll just say a little bit more about it. Let's look at rhythm first. You know, I'm sure, about stress timing theory. The idea is that stressed syllables will tend to recur at regular intervals of time in English and in other languages that are classed as stress-timed, but this will not be the case in languages classed as syllable-timed, such as is normally claimed for Spanish. If you know the literature on this, you will find plenty of people who will say it's not true that English is stress-timed, and you will also find people who will say it's not true that Spanish is syllable-timed. That's typical of the academic world. If somebody makes a global statement about something, 3 people will spring up and say that's not true because I have an alternative theory. But if you look at stress timing theory, it really depends on 3 principal components. The first thing is that English has a regular alternation between strong syllables and weak syllables. Now, that's a fact about English which I think nobody would dispute. I think this is uncontroversial. And it's one of the most characteristic things about English. If you hear a distant radio, let's say the radio, if there's somebody in the next house to you, or the next room, you can tell if it's English and not a language like Spanish, simply from the alternation between strong and weak syllables that you can hear. Even if you can't hear any of the phonemes, you can't have any idea what is being said. Nevertheless, the rhythm is very characteristic. The second thing is that stresses are located in particular places, and there are rules governing where those stresses come. If we didn't have predictable placement of stress, we couldn't have rhythm. And the third component of this theory is that we adjust the intervals between stresses so that they are regular. You know the idea, if we have 4 syllables between stressed 4 unstressed syllables between stressed syllables, we'll squeeze them so that they will fit into the time available, and if we have just 1 unstressed syllable between stressed syllables, we'll stretch it so that it fits the gap. The adjective procrustean is a useful one in this context. Do you know this one? There was a Greek myth about a giant called Procrustes, and he would stop travellers and invite them to spend a night on his bed. If they were too short, he would stretch them till they fitted the length of the bed, and if they were too tall, he would cut pieces off them until they were the length of the bed. So procrustean means forcibly altering the length of something to fit. I thought you might like that little adjective to add to your stock. My feeling is that there is no problem about 1 and 2, points 1 and 2 here, establishing a rhythmical characteristic for English. I'm more worried about item 3 because when I look in detail at spoken English, I don't find a lot of evidence for this compression and stretching. A little bit maybe, But the strong claim that this is done in order to regularize the interstress intervals, the evidence is not good when you look at this in an experimental, in a laboratory context. It's a nice idea for helping students to get a feel for the rhythm of English, but if you're making this as a claim about the reality of English pronunciation, I'm afraid that the evidence for it is not very strong. Rhythm is important in perception. If you're a non-native speaker who is in the role of listener, firstly, we have to accept, I think, that weak syllables are more difficult to recognize, and so if we are speaking with a large number of unstressed syllables, the task of the listener, the non-native speaker listener, is made more difficult. It does not follow from that if we changed our pronunciation of English so that all syllables were strong syllables, life would be easier. People have tried this as an experiment. Make all syllables strong syllables, and it becomes so different from English that people become very confused. So, although we know that weak syllables increase the difficulty of understanding English, there isn't really a way out of that. On the other hand, if you're trying to get people to repeat little bits of English in the early stages of learning, saying things with rhythmical patterns actually makes it easier for the learner to repeat and to get close to the style of the original speech. That's only a subjective view of mine. I have no evidence for this at all, but my limited experience of teaching early stages learners makes me feel that bringing in some rhythm early on with small pieces of English, small samples of English, can help in the process of repeating out loud. If you're a native speaker listener, we know that the rhythmic information, although it's rather weak, although it's not easy to detect, it is important in communication between native speakers. We're getting here into the territory of experimental psycholinguistics, which I have been involved in a little bit in the past. Rhythmic information is a help to listeners. One of the things that's been shown is that if there is a regular repetition of stressed syllables, it enables you to predict where the next stress will come, and therefore to identify possibly a difficult word which is following later. A lot of work in this area has been done by Professor Anne Cutler and her colleagues, and she's done some extremely ingenious experiments to show that although the rhythmical characteristic is very weak, it is there and it is exploited by native speakers. And I also mentioned the finding by psychologists that I find very interesting, that the rhythm of one speaker is picked up, just like key in discourse intonation, is picked up by the person responding. So the rhythm of the first speaker is picked up, many cases, frequently, by the person replying. If I'm speaking with a particular rhythm and somebody is joining in the conversation, typically they will, if they're good at conversational interaction, they will try to match the same rhythm. And it's said that when you get somebody who doesn't match the rhythm of one or more people in the conversation, the other speakers feel uncomfortable. This person doesn't fit. They're not being cooperative. They're being idiosyncratic. They're doing their own thing. Now again, that's rather anecdotal. There is some scientific evidence, but I can't bring it in here. And I think we could probably agree that if we have a non-native speaker who is using a rhythm that's completely inappropriate, perhaps because of a conflicting rhythmical pattern of their native language, then this is likely to make life more difficult for native speakers trying to understand what they say.